Okay, so Jews in the news. It's Monday, October 16th, and I apologize if some people were not aware of the change in schedule. I was supposed to be in Israel right now, leading a trip with 14 people from the congregation. Trip was canceled last week, so that means that I'm around today and next Monday, as opposed to having supposed to have been in Israel. So um, there's a lot to talk about, and I wanted to talk about the war in Israel and a Jewish perspective on a couple of aspects of this war that Israel is waging against Hamas. So, unless you are hiding under a rock, we know that Hamas invaded and attacked in a most brutal, barbaric attack not seen by the Jewish community since the Holocaust, where there were, for 6 years during World War II, uh, countless brutal attacks of the Nazis. I'm not just talking about the concentration camps. I'm talking about attacks like Babi Yar and other massacres in which the Nazis enlisted the, uh, the citizens of the countries they invaded, Ukrainians and Lithuanians especially, to do their dirty work. So the Lithuanians and Ukrainians were happy to round up Jews, march them out to the forest, and have them dig a trench, stand alongside the trench, and shoot them and murder them. And whether they died or not, they fell into the trench, and if they were alive, they died being buried alive. So we know of many stories like that during the Holocaust. So such brutality against Jews was not seen uh, since the Holocaust, but was seen again on October 7th. So it's indescribable. I have not seen. No, let me say it this way: the what I have seen uh, of pictures of these horrific crimes were filtered on ABC News and perhaps in Daniel Gordis's emails. I recommend, there are a lot of things that I read about Israel, and I get lots. I've subscribed to lots of emails, and one of them is Daniel Gordis. Daniel Gordis is a colleague of mine, graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary as a rabbi in the 80s, but then got his PhD and never served as a pulpit rabbi, but was an academic. His grandfather was Rabbi Robert Gordis, who was a longtime pulpit rabbi in Far Rockaway, New York, but also a world-renowned Bible scholar, and taught Bible at the seminary for decades. So that's who his grandfather is. Daniel Gordis himself became is as a well-known academic, has written a lot of books about different aspects of Judaism, and recently several books about Israel. So if you just Google Daniel Gordis, you'll see lots of books by him. I highly recommend his books. And he tends to be center leaning to the right when it comes to his opinions about Israel. So he is a pundit. He goes around the country. He comes to America often speaking about Israel. He writes about Israel. He's published articles, essays, op-eds, things like that. So if you're interested, you can subscribe to his weekly emails. now they're almost daily. I haven't gotten one from him today yet, but because of the war with Hamas, he's been publishing something every day. And so he posts some videos which have been graphic. So the details, though, that have come out about the course of the attack and the hours upon hours that Hamas held Israelis captive in their homes until they took hostages. And now the number of hostages today increased from 150, which was what we thought it was. Now it's 199 that Israel has confirmed have been taken hostage by Hamas. So who knows the condition of these hostages? We hope and pray they're still alive, but we don't know. Reports have been trickling out that Hamas claims that some hostages were killed as a result of the bombings that Israel has been doing in Gaza. So is that true? Or is Hamas actually killing the hostages and then blaming Israel for the death of the hostage by saying that Israel's bombing of particular buildings that killed the hostages? We don't know. We couldn't put anything past Hamas. So the barbarism that and inhumanity that was seen on October 7th continues in how, and has always been, the way Hamas has conducted its business in Gaza. And this is not well reported by mainstream media. I'm not going to talk about that. Because in many ways, trying to convince the mainstream media that they're wrong about how they're depicting Hamas is speaking to a brick wall. It's like talking to a brick wall, and we can't make any headway. And that is just, it's Hamas. I listen to WTOP when I'm in the car. Hamas continues to be called militants as opposed to terrorists. You really need to call it what it is, and we thank President Biden for calling out what it is. But everybody needs to agree, and there shouldn't be any point of contention about this. Hamas, they are not militants because they are not representing. They're not duly elected government of the Palestinians. They are de facto running Gaza, but they were not elected to run Gaza. So they are not an official government organization. Their army is not a recognized army. They are a terrorist organization with a charter which claims that Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. So that it is clear who they are and what they are. And Palestinians, if they felt that they could be safe and there wouldn't be any retaliation against them for saying it out loud, Palestinians would say they can't stand Hamas, but they have no choice. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. That Hamas has closed, because of Hamas's activities, the borders with Israel are usually closed. They haven't been recently. Israel has made concessions to allow Gazans to come into Israel to work, and Hamas took advantage of that graphically and horrifically on October 7th. Israel warned Gaza the past 2 days to leave the northern part of the Gaza Strip to seek safety. And Hamas told the residents of northern Gaza to not pay attention to Israel. It is propaganda. And if that's not enough to show that they don't care about their own fellow Palestinians, they also blocked the road, that the one and only road that leads that cuts through the Gaza Strip. So there's no way But despite that, so there are apparently 1.1 million people living in the northern Gaza Strip out of 2 million people living in the entire Gaza Strip. 1.1 million. As of yesterday, 600,000 were able to leave the Strip despite Hamas closing off the highway. So that's number one that I wanted to say, that there's a lot of talk about militant versus terrorist. Hamas are terrorists, and I've taken a lot of classes through the Hartman Institute with a person named Tal Becker. Tal Becker was employed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel. He made Aliyah from Australia, and is a longtime employee of the Israel's Foreign Service, and in that work has done a lot of work with negotiations with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and has done a lot of work in trying to define the term terrorism. And you would think there would be an easy term, an easy way to define terrorism. There isn't. There isn't an easy way. The United Nations has a definition, and suffice it to say that it is complicated and nuanced how we apply the definition of terrorist in this regard, applying it to Hamas. So it should be clear that what adds to the complication is then how does an entity do battle against a terrorist organization? How does a government entity do battle against a terrorist organization, right? So there are rules, there are international guidelines on how countries, that kind of entity is what I'm talking about, how countries should wage war against each other. It is quite clear, for example, the way Russia is waging war against Ukraine. Many aspects of that war are a violation of international law. The fact that in the process of war, Russia is attacking civilian areas, that's not what you're supposed to do. Threatening power plants, that's not what you're supposed to do. It's just two of many examples in which Russia is violating international law in its campaign against Ukraine. Okay, whether Russia will ever be brought up on charges is a whole other question, right? There were the Nuremberg trials against the Nazis after World War II. Would there be trials like that whenever the war between Russia and Ukraine is over, would ever happen? Who knows? But if there were such a trial, there would be evidence would be collected of Russia's crimes, and they would, who knows, they would be convicted, right? The civil war that was in Yugoslavia, right? The Serbs against the Bosnians against the Serbs, right? That there was an international war crimes trial about that. So depending on the war, there could be a trial. Would there be a trial? So the problem is a terrorist organization by definition fights against a country. But the methods that it uses, a terrorist organization uses to fight, are by definition against international law. They use means to guerrilla tactics and others that are not regular warfare. So this gets to the other point I wanted to talk about. How does Israel, in an ethical, moral way, wage war against Hamas? Now, one thing we also have to remember about Hamas is that, like I said, they don't care about their fellow Palestinians. They will use their own fellow Palestinians as shields and tools in its um, in its war against Israel and trying to uh, wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So, examples of this: Hamas, unlike a military organization or an army, does not have its own military base that is outside of a civilian population. They could, but they choose not to. Their military leaders are spread out over uh, apartment buildings. So their headquarters or their bunkers are within an apartment building. So so innocent Palestinians know that they're going to die if Hamas shoots rockets into Israel. And where are those rockets being shot from? Not from a military base, not from a separate area outside of a civilian population, but also smack dab in the middle of where people are living in Gaza. So you have rockets fired from within the civilian population. You have the terrorists themselves living among the civilian population, and the storehouse of their weapons is not a separate munitions warehouse far away from civilian population. No, these warehouses are found in schools, hospitals, and mosques. And so in the beginning, when Israel was retaliating, beginning the process of retaliation against Hamas on October 7th, there were pictures of mosques destroyed. Now you would say to yourself, is a mosque a target? No, it should not. A mosque should not be a target in regular war. No, a house of worship is never. It's remarkable that in World War II, the Notre Dame Cathedral and other cathedrals across Europe were spared. Well, that's because they're supposed to be spared. So Hamas, however, uses the mosque as a warehouse for munitions and other war materiel. So Israel has no choice but to attack and bomb these things. And as a result, there's heavy civilian collateral damage. And Israel bears the brunt of that. People, for some reason, the world doesn't want to know about why Israel attacked the mosque or the school or the apartment building. All the world cares about is seeing pictures of children and women wailing and crying and bloodied as a result. That sells papers. That gets attention to your website, your media location on the internet. That's what draws. And I'm not being cynical. Just look at the Washington Post. The Washington Post is the most pro-Hamas these past few days of any newspaper. I still get the Washington Post. I really don't know why, but I do. I like to have a paper in my hand, and it's disgusting to see the pictures. Because the New York Times, which is also pretty liberal, at least at the beginning, maybe not so much now, but on October 7th, they published an editorial in which they pointed out that Hamas was terrorist and pointed out the barbarity of the attacks. But now, not so much. Tide is turning, and Israel really doesn't have that much time left before all countries and maybe even America will say, we don't support you now in what you're doing. So that again, so I won't spend much more time on that. I'm not a military political strategist. I don't know the ins and outs of all this. I do know that from the sources that I trust, the news sources I trust, Times of Israel especially, what I'm sharing with you about Hamas and its use of mosques, schools, and hospitals. There was even a report that Hamas itself cut the power lines, most of the power lines into Gaza. So, though Israel did say that they were cutting off power, Hamas also cut the power line. So even if Israel were to restore power, they have restored water to the southern Gaza Strip. If Israel restores power, that there still might not be power because Hamas cut the power lines. So we have to understand who Hamas is and what their raison d'etre is, and that at all costs, and it doesn't matter fellow Palestinians or not, at all costs, Israel is to be wiped off the face of the earth. Okay, so the thing is now about this collateral damage. I want to spend a couple minutes on that, about the idea of how to retaliate in a moral and ethical way. Right. So if Israel was fighting an enemy like it did in 1973, right? So Israel, there was a Syrian army and there was an Egyptian army. And so when army fights army, any hands down, tank versus tank, Air Force jet versus military base on the ground, those are all legitimate targets, and Israel had to do what it had to do in order to survive that war. And nobody questioned anything that Israel did in the conduct of that war. In fact, there are rules about taking enemy combatants as prisoner, right? So Israel treated the prisoners, the Syrian and Egyptian prisoners, with respect, and gave them back at the end of the war, right? Negotiated the release, traded enemy soldiers for Israeli soldiers. That's the way it's supposed to work, and that's how wars are waged. Soldiers get killed. There could be civilian casualties, but that would be at the minimum because people would run away from the battlefield. There's a clear battlefield, and civilians run away in order not to be killed or injured in the course of battle. This is not the way that that Israel can fight Hamas, because, like I said, Hamas ensures that Palestinians will be killed in the course of this retaliation and in course of Israel protecting itself. Israel has the right to eradicate Hamas and protect its citizens. It's clear when you're fighting a terrorist organization that the method of clearing Hamas terrorists is different from how you clear an enemy battlefield. So Israel may not have a choice but to go from building to building to first find the hostages if they are still alive and save them, and at the same time to kill as many Hamas terrorists as possible, so that it'll be impossible, or at least take a very long time, for Hamas to rebuild. That is legitimate, and that anybody understanding who Hamas is and understanding what Israel has to do as a country should be in agreement with that process. However, what to do about the innocent Palestinians who are not terrorists? How can Israel fight this war with as limited amount of collateral damage as possible? So here's one idea about this, how to understand this. The Western world is based on a Christian understanding of the Bible. Namely, the sixth commandment of the 10 commandments is lo tirtzach. That's the Hebrew word. Two Hebrew words, lo tirtzach. In the English translation, the Christian translation of the Torah, that is translated as thou shalt not kill. In the Jewish translation, which I think is a more accurate translation, it is thou shalt not murder. So the Christian ideology is based on thou shalt not kill, and Jesus teaching to turn the other cheek. So Western world, Christian Western world, understands that all killing is bad. The Jewish morality and ethics based on the sixth commandment is no, some killing is bad. Murder is immoral and unethical. Murder is wrong. Killing sometimes is sanctioned. That to me is what this whole dilemma that Israel faces is based on. Israel as a Jewish state run by Jews who are raised with an understanding of Torah and understanding then how the rabbis understand the Torah, understand that sometimes killing has to happen in the pursuit of a moral and just society. There are many, many examples throughout rabbinic literature of how to protect yourself. If someone, so I'll give the example just because Jules is the other Zoom screen here. If Jules has a gun in his hand and clearly is out to get me, he makes it clear, Jonah, I have a gun in my hand and I'm going to shoot you now. If Jules makes his intentions clear, I have every right to defend myself, and defending myself could include killing Jules before he has the opportunity to kill me. Okay, that would be called killing in self-defense. It would not be called murder. It would be called self-defense. And self-defense is perfectly acceptable according to Jewish law. Now, a Christian understanding of that very same scenario could be different, that you don't kill until it's clear, absolutely clear, that you've been killed. And even then, maybe it's not appropriate to kill. Okay, so the abortion debate is based on this very concept. All right, so pro-life, the Christian understanding of pro-life is that once the egg has been fertilized by the sperm, that is life. Judaism clearly teaches that is not life yet. And even if it was life, it is a life that is dependent upon the mother to sustain it. If that fetus were to leave the body at that particular time, at 10 weeks, let's say, at 20 weeks, the likelihood of that fetus surviving independent of the womb would be zero, would be minimal to none. And therefore, there is a moral relative, there is a gradation of morality based on life. So if you have a choice of the life of the mother versus the life of this fetus, this embryo, and you have to choose, you choose the viable life over the not yet viable life. And the not yet viable life includes, even in the process of giving birth to a child, if the labor and delivery looks like it's going to kill the mother in that process, you abort that pregnancy, even in the process of delivery, in order to save the life of the mother. So, viable life, the idea of killing is in some circumstances is morally acceptable, are Jewish concepts. So therefore, the idea of weighing killing Hamas, knowing that civilians are going to die in the process, but knowing also that many more millions of Israelis will live safely, that is a no-brainer for a moral dilemma and how to solve it. If some Palestinians will die in the course of killing Hamas so that many millions of Israelis will live in peace, absolutely, absolutely warranted and acceptable. The problem is that not everyone agrees with that moral equation, and that's the problem that Israel is dealing with, because we have different definitions and understandings of the factors that are part of this moral equation. Jules, you have a question or a comment? Yeah.
No, I do, because I understand everything that you've been saying, and I agree with it. It's just that I keep saying, where is the real source of problems? The real source of problems with Hamas is Iran, which provides 88% of the funds that support it. So everybody shakes their head, yeah, yeah, yeah. But they sit over there and they control Hezbollah, which does the same thing as Hamas. And when and where was that
So Jules,
contest?
again, so we're getting into an area that is not my expertise, but I will say this. I will say this. I think the European Union and the United States understands that Hamas and Hezbollah are Iranian proxies. I think they understand that. However, there are global factors at play, because what would it mean? Just the process of instituting economic sanctions on Iran was an incredibly long process to do, because of the fear of some of these countries of repercussions, right? Because who's Iran friendly with? And then who Iran's friendly with could impact the economic relations that other countries have with those countries. All right, so again, that's about as far as my pay grade takes me in understanding all of this. But I will say this: why has Israel attacked and bombed airports in Damascus and Aleppo, Syria? Over the course of this past week, Israel has done that because those airports are used as transfer points of Iranian weapons on their way to Hezbollah and to Hamas. So Israel knows this. They have satellites in the sky. They see where these deliveries are coming from, and Israel attacks the airports there to be sure that those material would be destroyed, or at least the opportunity to transport them from those airports would be impacted and prevented from happening. So that's why Israel is doing that. And yes, and why is the United States bringing a second aircraft carrier group to the Mediterranean? It's to ensure that the Israel-Hamas war stays an Israel-Hamas war and doesn't become an Israel-Iranian war, which would be World War III, and could be nuclear, with then devastating consequences, right? And nobody wants to go there. So again, that's as far as my pay grade takes me. But what I really wanted to focus on is the first, about understanding that a Jewish understanding of how to wage war against Hamas can be morally different than how Western countries that are Christian based, in other words, Western democracies learning their moral and ethical values from a Christian understanding of the Bible, would be very different from how Israel wages the war, right? So that very few Israelis would be would be morally challenged by the death of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, in the process of Israel eliminating Hamas. Whereas so-called liberal Westerners raised, whether they're atheist or not, raised within the Christian democracies of Western world, have a very different take. And so much so that it allows them to color their understanding of who Hamas is, and affects their thinking that Hamas first is a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, at least in Gaza, which again is false. But they understand that, and secondly, they therefore see that Hamas is a legitimate fighting force on behalf of the Palestinian people, and that its attacks are seen as legitimate attacks against the occupying Israeli government. So those are all false narratives, and so much to the point that some Palestinian solidarity organizations, especially those on college campuses across the country, have used this image of the paragliders, the Hamas paragliding into Israel, right, on a little motorcycle with a parachute above them. That's seen as their symbol now for Palestinian solidarity. How warped liberal, so-called liberal people around the world who claim to be advocating for the poor and the disadvantaged. They claim to be advocating for the poor and disadvantaged, advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people. Okay, some of what they're arguing I can agree with. Yes, I think Palestinian people have the right to self-determination, but not for Hamas, and not even the corrupt Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, who there hasn't been an election in the Palestinian Authority in 15 years at least. So he is the president of the Palestinian Authority, but he has ensured that there haven't been elections since he was elected 15 or more years ago. So that's part one of his corruption. And part two, when he spoke to the UN back in September at the annual General Assembly in New York, he said that the Holocaust did not happen. So he's a Holocaust denier, and so and the left, the liberal left, does not call this out. There are certain basic moral truths. The Holocaust happened. These are terrorists who are doing barbaric deeds. They haven't been called out by the so-called liberal left in democracy. So that's why it was a shock to read the editorial in the New York Times on October 7th, October 8th, calling out Hamas as terrorists and saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. That was just shocking. The New York Times editorial doesn't do that normally. The fact that it did was good, but other organizations representing the Palestinians and other liberal organizations are just crying out for innocent Palestinians and totally denying or choosing to turn away from the clear images of the communities, the Israeli communities that Hamas invaded, and the clear evidence of the crimes against humanity that they committed. So it's the left that has to come to terms with its own moral makeup, and I have no idea how to teach them about this and how to change their minds. So I don't engage. I don't engage on social media at all. I don't read comments and posts on Facebook. I certainly don't go on Twitter or X as it's called now. I don't do that, and so I don't allow myself to get sucked in to something that that you'd just be disgusted about and there's nothing you can do about. I feel badly very much on the college campuses for Jews on the college campus because they are inundated with pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas literature and events that happen, and the presidents of universities who have been slow, if haven't yet, um, um, taken a strong stand against brutality. So the fact that presidents of Harvard and Stanford, for example, and other major universities haven't taken a stand, or it's been so watered down to be ineffectual, is really terrible. And it's only because Harvard and Stanford happen to have large Jewish populations with a very well-funded Hillel that perhaps the Jewish students can feel safe there because they know that Hillel is there. The other thing that I have seen is that perhaps the large donors to these universities, who many of whom are Jewish, could threaten to withdraw their funding. And that could be that could have the most impact on how universities, officials in these universities respond going forward. If they know that money is at risk, maybe they would be more willing to take a stand that would be seen as pro-Israeli or pro-Jewish. All right, so these are the elements I wanted to talk about today: militant versus terrorist, and what that means in terms of waging a war against Hamas, what it means to collateral damage and different understandings of the morality of killing, and also then the guilt that the left should be feeling about why they are so blindly pro-Hamas, even in the face of this despicable brutality. Jules.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You know, if we assume that that it is a fact that Hamas has dug into the ground to set up these stations where they fire from in buildings,
Yes.
under buildings, and they have no headquarters, then the logical result of that is either you don't fight them and you let them murder, kill, and hold hostages against you, or you go in to get to the holes. Now, how else do you get in there? You can't.
Well,
So
so I don't know. I think Israel has some methods that, of course, they're not going to share with the world. They, I the little bit that I've read on Times of Israel shows the IDF that quoting the IDF is saying, we know where some of the hostages are being held. Okay, so maybe their IDF is saying that in order to boost morale in Israel, but maybe it's also true that they know it. If they know it, the problem is how to get there, how to be sure that it's not booby trapped, how to get the hostages out safely, and then also how to limit the collateral damage. Okay, so these are all factors that the Israeli army has to deal with. So I'm sure they know a lot. They know where these tunnels are, and probably the problem is the tunnels start under these apartment buildings. So the only way to get at these tunnels is to blow up the buildings that are on top of them. And then, so that's what Hamas knows. Hamas knows we're safe because Israel's not going to survive the West if it blows up the tunnels, because by blowing up the tunnels, they'll be killing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, right? So this is the dilemma that Israel has to face. So they need They need to eradicate Hamas. How they can eradicate Hamas? What, by still maintaining a strong relationship with the United States? That's the question. That's the key. As long as the United States has Israel's back, then Israel can do things. But if they lose the United States backing, then Israel's on its own, and they risk everything. And though Israel could survive isolated, how long can Israel survive isolated? So that's the tragedy of the whole situation, and Hamas knows that. So Hamas doesn't have to fight so much. They just know that since Hamas doesn't care about their fellow Palestinians, Hamas has a different set of rules that are immoral and unethical. You know, how do you fight a monster when you know that a monster is fighting by different rules than you have? You have to. So and then what can never forgive Hamas for putting us in a situation in which we have to stoop to their animalistic, barbaric behavior. That is the true tragedy of this whole thing. All right, we'll stop here for today, and we'll have another session of Jews in the News next Monday. Have a good week, and we pray for peace in Israel.
Amen.